2004, the International Court of Justice rendered what was called an advisory opinion on the legal status of the wall. Now, some of you may know, perhaps most of you know, that the International Court, the World Court, ruled that the wall Israel was building was illegal under international law, that Israel had to dismantle the wall and had to pay compensation for the damages that were done. To my thinking, that's the least significant aspect of the World Court decision. The more significant aspect, in my opinion, is that in the course of rendering its opinion on the legality of the wall that Israel is building, the International Court preliminarily had to render an opinion on most of the final status questions. They couldn't decide on the legality of the wall until they decide on where are the borders of Israel. They couldn't decide on the legality of the wall until they decided on the legality of the settlements. And they couldn't decide on the legality of the wall until they decided on the legality of, or to whom East Jerusalem belongs. And so, in the course of rendering its opinion on the legality of the wall, the International Court of Justice rendered a landmark opinion on nearly all the fundamental questions bearing on the Israel-Palestine final status issues. So let's begin. Number one, the question of borders. What are the legitimate borders of the state of Israel, and what are the proper borders of the future Palestinian state? The World Court ruled that under international law, in particular Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, it's illegal for a country to acquire territory by war. Israel acquired the West Bank and Gaza in the course of the June 1967 war, and therefore, under international law, Israel has no legal title to any of the West Bank or any of the Gaza. Those are, as the World Court repeatedly says throughout its advisory opinion, those are occupied Palestinian territories, capital O, capital P, capital T. For those of you who read the human rights reports, they're often referred to as OPT. Now that includes the whole of the West Bank and the whole of Gaza. Often we're told, or we read in our media, that these are, namely the West Bank and Gaza, these are disputed territories. Allegedly, there is a controversy as to their legal status. But not so, says the World Court. There's no dispute whatsoever on the status of the West Bank and Gaza. Those are occupied Palestinian territories. Number two, what's the status of the settlements and the settlers who have moved to the, now it's the West Bank, the Gaza settlers and the settlements have been disbanded. What is the legal status of those? I think the current figure is 460,000 settlers in the West Bank and surrounding Jerusalem. Is that a controversial question? Not so, says the World Court. Under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, it's illegal for an occupying power to settle its population in occupied territory. Israel is an occupying power. Under international law, all the settlements and all the settlers are illegal. The World Court quotes the Security Council resolution stating that these settlements are a flagrant violation of international law. Number three, often said to be the most controversial question, final status question, the question of East Jerusalem. Israel claims, and its claim is often echoed, that East Jerusalem is part of its, quote, eternal and undivided capital. Well, not so, says the World Court. East Jerusalem, like the West Bank and Gaza, were acquired during the June 1967 war. the fundamental principle of international law. It's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Therefore, East Jerusalem, like the whole of the West Bank and Gaza, are occupied Palestinian territory. There is no debate, dispute, controversy whatsoever about that under international law. Now, that's still only part of the story, because international court decisions are often quite close. They're controversial, usually. So, for example, you can take the case of the 1996 World Court decision on the legality of the use of nuclear weapons. As most of you know, a fundamental principle of war is the distinction between targeting civilians versus targeting combatants. And the question came before the World Court, well, nuclear weapons obviously can't distinguish between combatants and civilians. Are nuclear weapons legal under international law? And interestingly enough, for reasons which ought not to detain us now, it was a very close question. It was 7-7 on the court. The tie-breaking vote was cast by the president of the court. And if you look at all of the documents pertaining to the decision, namely what's called the majority opinion, the separate opinions, the declarations, the dissents, it's a very hefty file. Fortunately, one day in the not so distant past, I was a university professor, so I was able to print it out on a university printer. Nowadays, I have to be more sparing about the ink, so it makes scholarly pursuits more challenging. But I did used to print out all of these documents, and these are very hefty documents, running into the 1,000 pages or more. Or you take the 1984 decision of the World Court on the United States' mining of Nicaraguan territorial waters. And again, if you look at the separate opinions, majority opinions, dissenting opinion, it comes to like a hefty 1,000 pages. And it was not a unanimous decision. But when you came to this particular case to which I'm referring now, namely the legality of the wall that Israel is building, the borders, the settlements to Jerusalem, there was no controversy at all. The vote was on the court, the vote was 14-1. That's not a close vote. And the one dissenting vote was the American Thomas Bergenthal, to whom I will get back to in a moment. In addition, the whole decision, if you take the majority opinions, separate opinions, the dissent, if you add it all together, it actually comes to less than 100 pages. It comes to so few pages, and the vote was so close, for the obvious reason that these are simply not controversial issues under international law. Countries are not allowed to acquire territory by war. That's what Bush Sr. said when Iraq invaded Kuwait. That was the exact line he used. Settlements are illegal under international law. It's blindingly clear, Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. East Jerusalem was acquired in the course of a war. It's not Israeli territory. And the issues are so uncontroversial that even the one negative vote, the one cast by Thomas Bergenthal of the United States, his negative vote was a very qualified negative vote. You have the option in World Court opinions of registering what's called a dissent or a milder form of disagreement, which is called a declaration. And Bergenthal chose to issue not a dissent, but a declaration. And he begins his declaration by saying, "There's much in the majority opinion with which I agree." And then he goes on to the crucial question, namely the question of those settlements. And he states, there can be no question but that under international law, those settlements are illegal. And he goes on to say, if Israel is building the wall to protect the settlements, it is, referring to the wall, ipso facto illegal as well. Well, that's a pretty remarkable finding if you're not familiar with the scholarly and the legal record, namely on what are said to be the most controversial issues bearing on the Israel-Palestine conflict. There is nearly a perfect consensus in the highest judicial body in the world. And on that consensus, Israel's position suffered a devastating defeat from beginning to end. On the question of its rights to the occupied territories, the court rejected any Israeli claim to any of the occupied territories. On the question of settlements, the court rejected all of Israel's claims on those settlements. And the question of Jerusalem, its supposed eternal and undivided capital, the World Court rejected all of their claims to Jerusalem as well. Let me now look briefly at the broad span of the conflict, namely the past, the present, and the future, and try to suggest to you what the actual record looks like. The historical record, until fairly recently, you could say there was not only a controversy, but you could say the Israeli version of the past was the dominant one. Yours is, most people in this audience are of a different age cohort, but in my age cohort, I think it's fair to say that the dominant version of the past was pretty much the one that was narrated by Leon Uris in his famous book, Exodus. If you added a few footnotes to Exodus, you'd get what most scholarship looked like until about 20 years ago. Let's take what used to be the most controversial question on the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, namely, how those Palestinians become refugees in 1948. For those of you who are new to the subject, in 1947, the United Nations voted November 47 to partition Palestine between what they called an Arab state and a Jewish state, and almost immediately a civil war broke out in Palestine, the indigenous population rejecting that partition resolution. By the end of that civil conflict, which then became an interstate conflict in May 1948, by the end, about 750,000 Palestinian Arabs found themselves outside their homes. And from that date until fairly recently, there was this huge debate: how did those Palestinians become refugees? Well, the standard Israeli claim was, in 1948, the Arab army stood poised to invade the newly born state of Israel, and they transmitted these radio broadcasts to the indigenous population, telling the Palestinian Arabs to clear the fields for the invading Arab armies, and after the invading Arab armies swept the Jews into the sea, then the Palestinian Arabs could return to their home. I suspect anyone here in this room will say over 40 or 45 will have heard that famous claim, the claim which found its way into most scholarship and certainly was the dominant view for quite a long time. Well, come the mid-1980s, some Israeli scholars begin to look at the question of the refugee question, examining Israeli archives, and they find that this claim of these Arab radio broadcasts, it just never happened. There's no evidence whatsoever that the invading Arab armies sent radio messages telling the Palestinians to flee. The best known of those historians is a fellow named Benny Morris, Israeli historian teaching over at Ben Gurion University, and he's recently said that what happened in 1948, he said it was an ethnic cleansing. The Palestinians were expelled from their homeland in 1948. And in fact, there's now a broad consensus among historians that indeed 1948 was an ethnic cleansing. There is some disagreement among historians. I can't say it's a perfect consensus. People like Benny Morris